It's 12:05. So hi everyone, thanks for coming. Welcome to our next session in our lunch break series. Today we have Glenn Brook visiting us from the University of Tennessee, where he works jointly with Oak Ridge National Labs. So I'm just gonna hand the floor over to Glenn if you just wanna take it from here.
Sure. Well, thank you, Jasmine. I appreciate the invitation to speak with y'all today, spend lunchtime with you. My understanding that you kind of like to get an idea of what my career trajectory's been and the opportunities and challenges and things like that that have been associated with it. So I guess I'll just kick off with kind of a background where I came from and where I ended up. So I'm originally from Mississippi. I grew up in Starkville, Mississippi, which is home to Mississippi State University. Right out of high school, in fact, partially in high school, I started working at the Engineering Research Center for Computational Field Simulation. So I've been involved in research computing essentially for, well, almost 30 years now, unfortunately. So one way or another, I've been in the field that entire time. Of course, computing for me goes all the way back. I started computing when I was 4, actually, and had access to the internet before it was available to the public and things like that. So I've kind of grown up with this notion of remote computing on servers, and that's kind of been central to a lot of what I've done. So I went to school at Mississippi State. I have an undergraduate in computer engineering with minors in chemistry and math, and almost another major in general sciences. I pursued graduate work there at Mississippi State in mathematics. I've got almost a master's degree in applied mathematics. I completed all the coursework, but ended up moving before I completed all the testing. And I did a lot of biology. I was pre-med in my computer engineering degree. I think I was the only computer engineer in the university who had done pre-med. And so I have a rather diverse background when it comes to sciences, but it's not very deep in any of them. I'm very much an engineer in my thought processes when it comes to implementing things. So I moved on into graduate school there at Mississippi State, had a fellowship, and started pursuing computational engineering, which is kind of built around 3 pillars. One would be computational mathematics. The other would be a particular application or discipline, which for me was computational fluid dynamics. And the last is kind of the general computer science HPC component, parallel programming. I did a lot of parallel architectures in school. And just about the time I was getting ready to graduate, a couple of life events converged to force me to relocate. And the first of those would be that my initial research advisor, I was doing computational quantum fluid dynamics at the time. He moved and took a department head position and only took 1 student with him who was within about 2 months of defending. So I had to change research groups, and I joined a new research team, and I had known the fella that ended up being my advisor, David Whitfield. I went to school with his daughters since 4th grade. I've known him for years. His wife was my dad's last doctoral student. So he swore to me up and down that they weren't going anywhere and I could finish up with them. And 6 months later, the entire research team was moved to the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. This time they took me with them. And so that's what prompted the relocation. I started a staff position at that point in time, but I was still enrolled as a student full time as well. And, years later, I finally wrapped up the PhD. I guess if I have one piece of advice for folks about school, this would probably be the first one. Don't spend 15 years getting your PhD. It's not economically advantageous at that point, really. But it has certainly enabled me to pursue the types of activities that I enjoy. And so it's made a lot of opportunities available to me that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So from the UTC computational engineering program, I graduated PhD in 2008. So I started school in 1993. And in 2008, it just so happened that I was in the right place at the right time when they were hiring for a new project in the National Institute for Computational Sciences. And it was a big NSF award, and it was an award to deploy what was at the time the #3 supercomputer in the world, Kraken. And I've got a few slides I can show. Why don't I show those now and kind of talk around them a little bit. And this will give you an idea of some of the resources that I've worked with. So I joined NICS as a computational scientist. And, you know, what does that really entail? Well, I provide support for a resource. In this case, it was Kraken, which, as I said, was #3 at the time. I worked as a consultant for a variety of scientific research teams across the country. And, you know, the primary goal was to help them use Kraken well and accomplish some tremendous science with it. And, you know, Kraken was a fairly unique machine. There weren't a whole lot of these crays at the time. It sat in the same machine room as originally Jaguar, which was #1. So #1 and #3 in the world were in the same machine room here at Oak Ridge National Laboratory for a number of years. We operated Kraken for NSF for about 7 years through some non-traditional scheduling approaches that we had started to use. We were able to maintain 95% utilization roughly on the machine, certainly through the last, 6 of those 7 years, and greater than 90% uptime, which at the time for Cray was absolutely outstanding. You know, there's a story behind how we came up with the scheduling. I was part of the acceptance testing for both phases, well, 2 of the 3 phases of Kraken. Kraken was initially deployed with a smaller machine that became later Athena, which was an XT3, and then transitioned to the XT4 and XT5. And during those acceptance processes, we have to run a huge number of scientific workloads. And they're all automated through a harness, and we collect stats. And so we have to trace down every single failure and identify what happened and why, and demonstrate that the machine is functioning the way it's supposed to. And so during one of those, the second one, when we were doing the upgrade to the Kraken to new processors, I decided I'd been discussing opportunities to improve our utilization, and I decided to experiment. So I hand scheduled the machine for about 3 days straight and got about a 15% improvement in utilization, 15 to 20%. And I did that because of the way I pieced the jobs together. So our original policies allowed you to, the machine would drain to run large jobs. And so what I did is basically just pack them all together. And so we took on a new policy where after maintenance periods, we had preventative maintenance and sometimes occasional emergency maintenances. We would always launch these full machine jobs. And that allowed us to support both what we call capability runs and capacity runs. So roughly 50% of the workload on Kraken over its lifetime ended up being single node jobs. It's fairly typical of NSF and Exceed. but we were the only site that allowed people to run at full scale on the machine. So we had a series of jobs and teams that ran at 115,000 cores. And I was the point of contact for managing that program and working with those teams. I've got some slides a little later on. We can talk about some of the science they did. So Kraken got old enough and had to be retired, and we deployed Darter. Much smaller machine, but we continued to operate it for 3 or 4 years for NSF. If you've never worked on a Cray, I guess probably the significant thing about Crays is their interconnect. It's far more scalable and lower latency than most of the interconnects that people are accustomed to working with. And so you can get significantly improved performance on a machine just by moving to the Cray. It wasn't uncommon for us to see 10 to 15% performance boost just by moving from an InfiniBand cluster to the Cray, and not doing anything else. And of course, you also get a wonderfully complete and pretty well optimized scientific computing stack with Cray, including all your libraries and things that you would use, compilers and debuggers. So Darter, I supported for a while. At the same time we did Darter, I had put in an NSF proposal and was lucky enough, once again, to kind of be in the right time, right place at the right time with the right idea. And I was awarded a $1 million grant to deploy a machine called Beacon. And Beacon was an extremely experimental machine. NSF had never done anything kind of like that up to that point. We actually deployed hardware that was under non-disclosure agreement with Intel, and we made it available to third parties. And that was the first time Intel had ever allowed anybody to do that either. And so the project ended up, we spent roughly the first 9 months of the first year wrangling all the legal agreements necessary to cut a 9-way NDA across universities and industry. But once we got it up and going, it was a very successful project. Successful enough in the first 15, 16 months that the university came back and provided another $1.3 million in funding to expand the project. And that led to a deployment that ultimately ended up taking #1 on the November 2012 Green 500 list. We unseated all of the blue jeans that had been reigning supreme for years on the list. And the project itself was not just the machine, it was also an engagement program and education program built around it. So we literally went out and selected project teams across the country, kind of in individual fields. So, we had an astrophysics team, and we had a chemistry team, materials team, and these sorts of things. And we funded graduate students in their team to actually help facilitate use of the new accelerators, Xeon Phi accelerators. At the time, they were Knight's Ferry originally, and they became Knight's Corner. And now there's still some in deployment that are actually in a socketed version that are called Knight's Landing. And so ultimately, we ended up supporting somewhere order of 100 projects, and total. We had 60 that were really active. And we had about 1,000 total users that used the machine at some point, but really we had about 383 that were really active. So, that's the strange thing is this is a much smaller machine. Interestingly enough, we got basically the power of Kraken. We went from half a machine room, a tremendous number of racks, down to 5 racks basically, and got the same performance, 5 years later. That's the joy of accelerators, right? So this project went on for, ultimately the project was funded for 2 years. We had a continuation for a year. And Beacon still continues to this day as part of the Advanced Computing Facility, which has recently been rebranded as ISAC, Instrumentation for Scientific Application and Advanced Computing, or something like that. And it formed the backbone of that you know, activity and project for a while, and I'll get to that on the next slide. So some of the interesting things about Beacon, I got to work with some of the best scientists in the world. I had people all over the place, and ultimately it led to you know, more than 55 related publications, and in particular, at least 5 Intel parallel computing centers. So because of the way Beacon had worked and the success of some of the program and the engagement model, Intel began funding people directly to engage on the K&Ls and K&Cs, and basically replicated kind of this program we have with graduate students. And so when they did that, they called them the Intel Parallel Computing Centers. And we had 2 of the first 5 in the world here, and went on to have another 3 out of this unit through this IPCC. And there were 4 other sites across the country at the time. They've since expanded the program. You may have seen some stuff here recently where there's some sites in Europe that are branded as Intel Parallel Computing Centers that are working on one API. I just recently got another award from Intel to do some work on a mini app with one API. So this program is kind of still going. And Beacon also has a little bit of a legacy in the fact that it laid the groundwork for all of the policies and legal paperwork and stuff that actually went into the initial agreements for Argonne's Aurora machine, the exascale machine with Intel.
So I have a little bit of a question, actually.
Okay, go ahead.
You mentioned, you know, you getting this PhD and then, you know, kind of, you know, jumped right into the supercomputing arena. How much did the PhD influence, like, how far you were able to go and like your interactions with Intel or other, you know, academics? And how was it working at such an interface? You know, it's kind of
sure
intersection of 3 different things.
Thank you for the redirection.
Yeah. Just you get, you know, you had a nice flow going, but before I
run out of time, I got you. Okay, so you know, to answer that very directly, the PhD has been integral. I don't think I would have been able to achieve what I've achieved and gotten to where I have been without it. And that's for a couple of reasons, right? You know, the first is that, you know, it's kind of the credential, it's the key that unlocks a lot of doors, right? You get to serve as PIs, you get to relate to other PhDs and scientists on kind of an equal level. There's a tendency, we do have computational scientists who have not had PhDs, but more often than not, there's a tendency to kind of treat them less as collaborators and more as hired staff when they're consulting on projects.
Do you feel like if you had started your journey of the PhD, but let's say you got 75% through and you're like, you know what, I had this great job offer on the side, I have enough, you know, experience, I have a good skill set. Do you feel like your trajectory would have changed even, you know, a little to dramatically if you hadn't procured the PhD? Like, do you feel like,
yeah,
like are you saying now there's this glass ceiling between being a research scientist with a PhD and without?
I don't know if I would call it a glass ceiling, but I would call it a gradient of opposition for sure.
I like, like
it's, you know, there's a point you start climbing through the ranks, and you can make up for it with experience, but the amount of effort to get the experience and the amount of time probably greatly exceeds the effort it would have taken to finish the PhD while you were in school. Okay. Now, what I can tell you is, you know, I happened to have my first child while I was trying to do my PhD. That's never a good idea. It's not very compatible. I also started working as a full staff member before I finished my PhD. Once again, probably not the best solution. But because of the series of factors, it was the only solution that really made sense for me at the time. So what did the PhD really enable, right? Well, amongst other things, there was a salary boost right outside the door, right? And that in and of itself was kind of critical to me because I'd spent 15 years in college. And so I was already well behind the curve. The other thing it allowed was, like I said before, I can serve as a PI on proposals and grants to NSF, to other agencies. There's a degree of independence that comes with it that does not necessarily come with functioning with just a master's degree. The other thing that I would say that is kind of critical is going through a dissertation process, going through the research that's accompanied with it. There's a set of skills. Some are kind of direct and obvious, and some are more intangible that you come away with that help you with these later processes. That in many cases, as in my experience, most master's students don't get direct exposure to. And it comes down once again largely to the degree of independence and the types of problem solving that you end up having to work your way through. And so, in that sense, I think, yeah, it has made a difference. And I would encourage people who are looking to go into research and want to lead research teams or, lead general programs. The PhD is really kind of a necessity still. If you want to work in a high-tech HPC scientific computing environment, but you want to do so more as a research associate or, you're still professional. And there are people who don't have PhDs that are every bit as good or better than many of us that do. But the difference is they end up working in that position for a lot longer before they see the advancement levels. So that's kind of where it stands, what it is. It makes a difference. The other thing that probably impacted me was it helped me. Like I said, I kind of had a broad background going through undergrad. I drifted around. I did a lot of sciences and engineering. And then in a master's program, the target is really to kind of, at least from my perspective, the target is to refine a set of skills, professional skills, right? Preferably in a rather concentrated area. And, sometimes you choose that to be something that's going to be complementary to your overall objective. So maybe you started off with an undergraduate in the science field and you decided to move into a master's degree in, a computational field to develop those technical skills that maybe you didn't get as much exposure to because you didn't come from an engineering or a computer science background in undergrad. And then, you move into your PhD. Your PhD ends up being what kind of sets the primary direction for everything. Are you tied to it? No. But it certainly, like I said, heavily biases gradients in certain directions for you. And so, one thing that my PhD is in computational engineering. So one problem I ran into right out the door, computational engineering existed in like 2 schools in the country when I got the degree. Okay. There was not a department of computational engineering anywhere. So consequently, I started to apply for, assistant professorships and postdocs and things. And back then in engineering, it wasn't as common to have as many postdocs as is common now. You could actually, if you were near the top of your class and had good experience, you could potentially land an assistant professorship very shortly out of school. The problem I had was I did not have a degree in aerospace engineering. I did not have a degree in mechanical engineering. And so I didn't really get the opportunity to join those faculty programs. Once again, it was because the cross-disciplinary program didn't really have an academic home in most universities. Now that's changed over the years, and now there are actually some places where you have computational science and mathematics units together as a department or college. And same thing with engineering. But at the time, that was, one of the things that I didn't anticipate because I thought, hey, cool, this is a cutting edge program. It's high tech. I'm getting great experience at one of the best places in the nation for doing HPC at the time. And I just thought, hey, this will open doors. And it did, just not the academic doors I expected it to open. So, I would strongly encourage you when you're considering PhDs to look at what it is you really want to do long term and make sure your PhD aligns with that, especially if you're looking at working in academia. Because there, like I said, once again, there are gradients against drifting too far from that.
So you kind of mentioned, maybe it was an undertone, but you wanted to do still a little bit more academia based things. Which were some of the things that you had hoped to, as you were transitioning with your PhD, keep that like came from academia, what you wanted to take to your new work environment?
Well, so one thing that has happened for me, I'm research staff. I'm professional research staff. I have been essentially my entire professional career now. And that comes with a lot of benefits. Like I said, on the research front, I have a lot of freedom. But it means that I am, first and foremost, funded off soft money all the time. So what does that really mean? That means that I'm funded off project funds. There is not money in the annual state budget to cover my salary. So if research drops off, I have to find a way to refund myself, right? So I'm constantly struggling with these proposals and trying to bring in the funds to pay for my salary and my team's salary. Whereas if you end up going into an academic posting, right, you actually have a faculty line and that comes out of state budget. And so you most places you have a set number of years, give or take a little bit, to get tenure. And if you get tenure, then you basically have your faculty line as long as you want it, short of some really, horrible, egregious things you could do. But, so that's a big difference there. That affected opportunities. But the other thing that has been a struggle, and I'll just say a little of a disappointment, is I'm walled off from students. I don't get to serve as advisors directly very often. Once again, because I don't have teaching faculty status. And so I can have students work with me, but I can't serve as their research advisor. And so I have to have a collaborator on campus, and they have to have a project with that collaborator that happens to align with my research interests and my funding. Well, these are a lot of things that you have to get in a row.
And even as an employee of UT, you still have these major roadblocks.
Yes. Yeah. I can't just go out and grab a student. It just doesn't happen, right?
So would you say it's worse then for employees that don't even possess a PhD? And let's say if you had a master's and you joined.
Yes, it would be. Okay. Absolutely. In most cases, those types of positions are not the type of position in which you'd be soliciting students to work with you anyway, most of the time. So I led a team for the last 6-7 years. Actually, it's longer than that now. 8 years. And on that team, I would hire, 2 to 3 computational scientists that had PhDs. I had a couple that had master's degrees, and I ran an internship program, and that's the way I got to students. So students would come and work for me as interns. And so I could get typically folks over the summer that wanted to come and get a specific set of skills or experiences. Graduate students, I had a number, several. I even had a high school student actually that came from Texas and lived here and rode his bike into the lab every day because he, it was, but, and strangely enough, he was actually one of the best students I've had in terms of what he accomplished, especially from the computational point of view. He had already won a national programming competition, so I didn't have to spend a lot of time on training his programming skills, and we were able to jump more directly into the research components. So some of the key components that when I get students, especially from science disciplines, that are missing in order to do the kinds of things that I do and to run on the kinds of resources that I've supported. The very first thing is an understanding of parallel computing architectures and how to program for them. And so that's that's not something to easily develop if you're only a very basic programmer to start with, right? So if you've got, I'll say, rudimentary coding skills and you want to move to a parallel environment and actually do so in a meaningful manner that's going to give you a reasonably good utilization of the resource, you've probably got at least a year's worth of training to get there. Possibly more than that, depending on what your background is and how quickly you learn some of the technical components. And so that's kind of what creates the job niche that I sit in, right? A lot of times you'll have a lot of extremely great researchers, and they've got the ability to write code and do stuff, and they run on their laptops. But there's a big difference between running on your laptop and running on a number 1 or number 2 supercomputer in the world. And there's a lot of details and a lot more knowledge and skill that goes into that than most people probably realize initially. It's usually a surprise to folks. And it's actually a little, it less so now. We're getting better tools, but when I started, there was a little bit of an art form to it. You wouldn't always know. It wasn't clear that you could run this and do this and get this data and know what the right answer, the best answer or best solution was. And so you kind of, different computational scientists develop different backgrounds and different styles, so to speak. And so that would kind of be guided by the teams they'd worked with.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to take a moment here to just now pause the conversation, kind of open up the floor to anybody that wants to ask you specific questions, because we are coming up on kind of the last 20 minutes of our session. So
sure.
If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself and say hi.
So here, I will stop this and see if I can find chat.
Yeah, we can also read you questions off the chat if they come up there, so you don't have to go back and forth.
I've got it open to the side now. So
perfect. I can kick this off. I have a question about training.
Okay.
You're mentioning the difference between a laptop and a supercomputer, which I myself have definitely experienced as somebody who has never taken a formal course in computing. I'm entirely self-trained. And as astronomers, we have some very specific ways to do things. Like a lot of my advisors actually coded entirely in IDL.
Okay.
And so it was a big transition that I was coding in Python. So I guess my question would be, how would you recommend that students or even just people that want to think about a career change into more of the high performance computing or as a research scientist associated with a high performance computing center, how should people go out and maybe retrain themselves or get training in the first place?
That's a good question. And, I've actually been dealing with it. I've got a son who's a senior in high school this year, and I've been trying to push him in some of those directions too. So, we're very fortunate now to live in a time where, in general, there's good internet access and there are lots of resources available. So the first place I would actually start these days is to look at some of the programs that are offered by either some of the universities. There's a lot of free training courses out there for different aspects of things. You'll find everything from rudimentary HPC using C and C++ all the way to Python. There are lots of good courses available on Coursera and Udemy and things like that. And for the most part, they do a good job of giving you what I'll call a kind of a boot camp quick introduction, right, to things. Another experience that I would encourage, especially if you're looking at trying to move into using GPUs, is the NVIDIA does a set of programs with their Deep Learning Institute, and they have like an intro to data analytics with their stack, and it's built on Python. And it shows you how to use their optimizations to take what you would have done with your basic Python, NumPy, whatever else, and move it straight over to significantly improve performance on GPUs. Now, is that the best move for a scientist? Absolutely. Is that going to give you the bleeding edge, I'm going to get a Gordon Bell Prize kind of performance? No, it's not. That's where you've got people who have done, bare metal and assembly coding and stuff like that are getting way down in the weeds. I don't really recommend that for most people, though. I mean, that's got to be what you're focusing on for your career for that to be reasonable. In your case, though, I would say the first place I would definitely start is Python these days. Right? It's interpreted. It can be partially compiled, JIT compiled. It's got a broad range of libraries available, and they're tied into a broad range of professionally developed and maintained computational numerical libraries. All the vendors provide some interface now. If you're going to be running on CPUs, the easiest thing is to probably go out and grab the distribution from Intel. It's tied into Conda now, so you can just load it that way. If you're going to be running on GPUs, the best thing to do is go out there and get the NVIDIA HPC development kit and the tools there and use them. The two are not mutually exclusive, but you need to be able to pay a little care if you start crossing up libraries between different vendors. Sometimes you can run into some compatibility problems. But that would be my first point. And in particular, if your focus is heavily on data analysis and that sort of stuff, as opposed to computational simulation, that would be the route I'd go. If you're looking at computational simulation and modeling at large scale, I come from a field where codes are still largely written in Fortran. So, I mean, you're going to have to dig into some of the more bare metal programming application approaches and techniques. C++ is where I would direct you these days. But ultimately, you'll brush up against, as a computational scientist, you would brush up against Fortran and C, and like I said, in some cases, assembly. So, but the best places are really I would start with a basic Python program. I would build up from there, and then I would branch out into the trainings offered by specific vendors like Intel and NVIDIA. Colfax has a wide variety of stuff. CodePlay, if you're getting into the one API stuff that Intel's doing these days. So, like I said, fortunately, over the last 5 to 10 years, the vendors have put a lot of effort into making it possible to easily retrain to their technologies. Take advantage of it. It's free in most cases.
So we have another question from, thanks Glenn for that. That was great, Rebecca, as well. We have another question from Maurice. Maurice, if you'd like to speak.
Thanks, Jasmine. Yeah, thanks Glenn for the talk and everything and for explaining all of this. I have I don't know, 3, maybe 4 questions, but I'll try and narrow it down to just like 1 or 2. It's mainly about your grant applications, proposals, and you mentioned soft money positions as well. So I guess my first question is, since being on soft money, what is for you specifically, I know it may be different depending on where you work or what project you're working on and what collaborations you're a part of, but for you specifically, what is your frequency of applying for proposals? Like, do you apply like 3 a year and then hopefully get 1?
Well, I wish. No, it fluctuates based on what your funding situation is. So in this case, we've won some very large center awards. So for instance, the Kraken Award was a $65 million award. And so you can fund your people off of that. The problem is it runs out eventually. So you better have used that to develop research infrastructure that you can use to go get other funding. Personally, my record in 1 year is 11 proposal applications, 11 proposals of various different forms. And of those, 2 were funded.
Are you okay, so that's like 1 out of 10 essentially.
10% is a good number in most cases. That's and until you have a very well-established research program, which is once again a little bit harder if you've got kind of a diverse, as a computational scientist, NSF tends to fund in domain science rather than across domain sciences. And so if you can't go after specific proposals inside a domain and build up a research team around a domain, then your opportunities are also reduced in terms of the number of things you can submit to and the number of people competing for them too, in some sense. But once you establish a strong research program, you can usually maintain at least a minimal stream of funding. And I guess you could say that's what I've got with Intel to some extent right now.
Do you so that's like, I guess, so it sounds like you're explaining like the difficulty. I think you mentioned this earlier too, the difficulty with being like interdisciplinary, or in your case it was more so you were interested in its cutting edge sort of field, and then there were hurdles that you weren't aware of originally. So I guess even a cutting edge field just doesn't have a pipeline of funding from the government as established as
Right. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. There are, I'll just say, academia has been around a long time. There are established traditions, there are established mechanisms to fund things, and folks defend their territory fiercely because there's, in many cases, a very finite amount of money available in different areas. And it's largely conservative from year to year. So if you get more, somebody else out there in your community that you may even work with on occasion or run into and be friends with at conferences is getting less. And so like for HPC, just look at the machine awards that we've done and what they're funding these days, right? So Kraken was a $65 million award. The follow-ons to replace Kraken were $35 million total, 30-ish, 38, something like that. The follow-ons to that program were about 20. The follow-ons to that program were 10. And this call right now that I'm working on to respond to is a $5 million call. So in general, the funding for a lot of fields has remained relatively flat, and the costs have continued to appreciate. And so it just puts a lot of pressure on those funds. And that directly translates into the difficulty to get funding. I mean, you really have to be well-established, well-known, politically connected. People have to recognize your work and what you're doing. For you to have kind of I won't say a fast track, but an easier gradient through that process.
Yeah.
If you don't have all of those things in your hand, then it's a fairly stiff uphill battle. You got the right idea and the right background, you can get the money. So I'm not saying that you're shut off from it. Just you're going to have to go out there and fight for it.
What about as you learn these sort of difficulties, and it's a lot more than just what it's who and just like you said, limited funds, even though the cost is essentially increasing. So with being at your national lab, is there any, well, it sounds like there aren't any restrictions necessarily with with what awards or what grants you can apply for. So for example, being at a NASA facility, I've heard scientists for NASA facilities or space centers say that they can't apply for certain, grants. They can only apply for NASA.
Right.
So with your national lab, it sounds like since you can apply for NSF, there is no.
Well, let me make a very important distinction. I work for the University of Tennessee, stationed at the National Lab. I'm in a joint institute that is managed out of the lab and the university. I am technically university staff. Thus, I can go after NSF funding. In ORNL employees that are employed directly by UT Battelle at the lab target DOE funding predominantly. They can go after DOD, but mainly DOE. Very few of them end up with NSF funding. In general, the funding agencies try to keep some walls up, and that has to do with the perception of how the funding is spent and where it goes. And so Congress has to allocate these monies to these different, entities up there, all the three-letter agencies. And with that is kind of an implied intent. And if you start spending that money on something that doesn't align with the objectives of those funded entities, then you're spending money outside of essentially the realm that it was intended to be authorized for. And you start hearing things like subverting the will of Congress and things like that. So it's very much the case that you'll end up in most people will end up in their career falling into a bin where they are predominantly getting funding from one or two specific agencies. And it's not necessarily easy to transition across them or amongst them.
Do you feel like it's similar, aside from grants winning funding, just with I don't know what to call it. You mentioned that at your national lab, which is the same as NASA facilities, they give you a certain annual sort of stipend, and if you don't win grants that year, you get to live off of that, but it's very, very limited. It's not enough. So that's why, soft money positions, you have to reapply. But with that, whatever it's called, stipend, I don't know, is there, I don't know, if you're interdisciplinary or if you're on the cutting edge of some new field, how you've learned how it works on the grant level, but what about the actual staff position level?
So if you really want to be on the bleeding edge of research and have stable staff funding, one of the best places to do it is going to be one of the national labs. The labs have direct funding from the agencies, and it can be used in a variety of different ways. And most often what happens though is the labs also have a large number of very large awards projects, right? So for instance, here at Oak Ridge, you've probably seen stuff about Summit and all the work that they've been doing with the COVID and that kind of stuff in the news. Well, Summit sits within the Oak Ridge Leadership Computing Facility. The Oak Ridge Leadership Computing Facility is essentially a large, it's funded very heavily, almost probably predominantly off of the award to deploy and operate Summit. Right. And in fact, OLCF, which, the actual division that OLCF overlays and sits in is the National Center for Computational Sciences, was the model for the National Institute that deployed Kraken. So in essence, we were the NSF arm at the university that mirrored the National Lab arm for the DOE on the National Lab side. And that's fairly typical. You'll see, most of the labs, there's some core funding. Here in my specific joint institute, basically what happens in an academic university environment is every research grant you go out to get, right, there's an overhead charged against it for all the people money, right? Equipment doesn't incur overhead, but all the people and that kind of stuff do. And, you know, it varies from university to university what the negotiated rate is. For instance, our rate here, I think it just went up this year to 53%. I know some of them have 60%, right? So I may go out and go after $1 million grant, but you know, if I've got, say, a 50% overhead, well, that means that essentially a third of that grant has now gone to the university, not to me. And that money then flows down through the hierarchy at the university in whatever various percentages, and some of it makes it back to your unit. So in our case, for instance, JICS is considered the equivalent, since we're an institute, we're considered the equivalent of a college. So we get 40% of the overhead money back. And then whoever the director of that institute is has authority to use that. So that can be used to provide what you're calling a stipend. I would caution you though, in my case, there is no guaranteed stipend, so to speak, right? And you know, now the reality is that when there's not enough pieces of grants to piece together to cover somebody fully, you make up the remainder out of these kind of overhead return funds, research funding that comes back to you. So that's the typical approach that's taken, and my understanding is that that's fairly common across all of academia, university settings for sure.
I see. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Okay, with that, I think I'm gonna start to wrap up our session before we
Okay.
get to the hour. Thank you so much, Glenn, for joining us. This was very, very enlightening, and I'm sure it helped a bunch of people out in this session, but we really appreciate you.
I appreciate the opportunity. I've enjoyed it. If anybody has any further questions, I'm happy to answer some via email.
Yeah, I'm happy to either circulate your email or you can drop it in the chat right now so that people that would want to take it down can contact you directly. But thank you again so much for coming.
There you go. It's
All
easy.
right. Thanks. And to let people know, we don't have a meeting next week. We're going to skip 1 week because it's the election. Meet next 2 Tuesdays from now.
Yes, and we'll be inviting the Chief Flight Director of NASA Johnson. So hope to see you guys then. Thank you again, Glenn.
Take care, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.